Let's go gambling! Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it.
Call it what you want, American culture signifies that most of us at some point or another, before a time of SUVs, you needed to be driving a sedan. And that's because it represented American culture at its finest, particularly consumerism. But the reality is that for over the last 40 years, American car makers have struggled to make sedans work. While they could make SUVs and pickups work, they couldn't quite meet the expectations of the consumers, particularly because of that little bitty annoying thing called the Japanese manufacturer. Now, between Honda, Toyota, and Nissan, they have absolutely destroyed the American sedan market. And it's been such a nuisance for the American makers because they could not just figure out how to make that process work. And in this video, I'm going to go explore that. What's up, guys? My name is Chris, and welcome to the Breakdown, where we talk about everything cars, news, and reviews. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, welcome back. So here's the thing. In recent days, we begin to see more and more car companies get rid of the sedans. Nissan recently announced that they would be getting rid of theirs. And of course, the Mazda 6 was disappearing. And of course, the Malibu, Impala, the Fusion disappeared a long time ago. And the Chrysler 300 alongside that. There's really no room for sedans, let alone American sedans in this space. And in this video, I really wanted to explore why the American car makers just could not get it right, but more importantly, how we got there, and is there any hope for a return of the American sedan? With that being said, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching The Breakdown.
USA. See your Chevrolet. Start the 60s right with the finest Chevy ever.
For too long now, America has been taking a beating at the gas pump. And for too long, America has been depending on imports for high-mileage cars. Well, Yankee ingenuity is still alive and well. The new Chrysler Corporation introduces the K-Cars, the American way to beat the pump.
Making the dream come true for you. Making the dream come true.
Now, before we get started, I think what's really important, in case you're new to the channel, is to always provide context. I'm a bit wordy, so I like to explain things.
Don't judge me.
But before we get started, I want to explain what a sedan is. So a sedan, unlike a SUV or a coupe body style or even a wagon, has what is essentially a three-compartmented section, which basically consists of the engine, the passengers, and the trunk. Now, the term has been coined since roughly around 1911. But before we get into that, I think it's important to understand what a sedan is, unlike that of a coupe, which usually consists of two doors. But it is to be said that sedan, especially used back in the early 1900s, could mean 2 or 4 doors. So I want you to also put that in context. You would think that Henry Ford would be the first person to develop a sedan. For whatever reason, we just always equate the development of the automobile to either Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler or to Henry Ford, and that would be absolutely wrong. The first person on record to have a sedan style design, whatever you want to call it, is Frenchman Nicolas Cugnac back in 1770. Now, his was steam powered. It was not gas powered. And for a long time, many of these sedans, coupes, wagons were all modifications or iterations of the horse-drawn carriage. And the sedan represents a really, really good point of where you could really be in a really refined stagecoach design and pretty much give high class. And if we're being frank, a lot of cars were for the high class. They were not for the lower class up until Henry Ford. So I think that's why a lot of people get that confused. But anyway, the first American sedan was created back in 1893 by the DeRay brothers, which pretty much the story goes that they bought a horse-drawn carriage for $70, basically ripped it apart, put a 4 horsepower engine in it, and tested it in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and pretty much created the first internal combustion engine sedan. Now, it did break down after a couple of miles, but they had the tools to get it right, so they put it back together. Shortly thereafter, around 1899, about 30 car companies making over 2,500 cars would be sold, and it was on and popping. The American car industry was up. We was up, babes. We was up. Now, a decade later, there would be 485 car companies that were trying to get in on the gold rush. As we all know, a lot of them did not make it, but the ones that did make it, I'm sure you are aware of, are the big three, which would be Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Now, they all didn't start out as the big Goliaths that they are today. Obviously, a lot of it came from mergers and acquisitions, and that's not unlikely because it is capitalism. But the first actual sedan that is on record recorded as the term was coined was the Studebaker 4 and 6, which you could get for roughly about $1,500 back then, which would be the equivalent of $47,000. Now, $47,000 was pretty pricey back then, as I said before, because it was for the higher elite class. I wish I had a monocle so that I could go along with the high class thing today, but I can't afford anything on eBay. And with that $47,000 or $1,500 back then, it got you a long stroke bored engine, it got you headlights, and it also got you a starter. Now, if you didn't know, General Motors is actually the first people to develop the starter with Cadillac. And so between 1920-ish to 1930, the American car companies was at it. You hear me? Between Chrysler and GM really going into cahoots to get against Henry Ford because he was running shit with the Model T, which of course that's what most people know the American car to have originated. But as we know now, there is more to the story. But the difference between Henry Ford and General Motors at the time was that Henry Ford believed that y'all didn't need else but that Model T, and if we gonna get fancy, that Model A. Whereas General Motors, they didn't really care. They just wanted to give you options or the optical illusion, because the truth is, not only did General Motors give you something else that you thought you were getting different, but you never actually got anything different, as a lot of it was kind of the same things with some different modifications. But they did have tiers to what they were offering. And Cadillac was kind of their premier brand, but Buick is their oldest brand alongside Oldsmobile and Chevrolet. Now, of course, throughout the years, they would acquire more brands such as Pontiac, Saab, and of course, there's other things in that, but we're not talking about that right now. So between Ford and GM, oh, it was battle royale. They was going at it.
これは大当たりですね。
But American consumers knew that they enjoyed the American brands, and we haven't quite globalized yet. So this was all local. This was all in the United States. And fast forward into the 30s, we enter into the Great Depression, and a lot of the car companies at the time had dissipated because essentially they couldn't really afford anything. And a lot of car companies dissipated because a lot of us obviously know the Depression happened, which of course caused a lot of people to run out of money. I hear that happens during the Depression. But over in Japan, Mr. Kichiro Toyota had pretty much set in stone just-in-time manufacturing. This is a big deal because while the American industry was building itself up because Henry Ford had pretty much formulated the assembly line, Toyota was really focusing on the quality control of how they were going to make parts more efficient and optical for ordering because it was good business. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. So towards the 40s is World War II. We don't really talk about World War I enough, but a lot of the American makers were indeed helping out with the war efforts for World War I and World War II. But World War II is where obviously it was at odds with Germany, Japan, and the United States as we got into it, and some things happened, and obviously between a couple of bombs, we know exactly what happened. Fast forward into the return efforts of the United States for veterans and the baby boom of the 1950s, and America is on a golden road. During this time, Ford was really struggling to make things work, especially after the war efforts, and the 1949 Ford would be the one thing that would save them. But between the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a lot of cars that really made things happen. Between the luxury tier, the premium tier, the performance plus, performance value, if you will, as well as the mass market. The mass market, which would be Chevrolet, Ford, and Plymouth, which were all derivatives of their mass market names, with the exception of Plymouth to Chrysler, they were really catering to the American market because it was everything. Even the ads, if you look at the way that they were giving it to us, and everything in terms of American consumerism is tied into the development of these brands. Of course, you had things such as Pontiac, you had Oldsmobile, Edsel, DeSoto, Mercury, Buick, Chrysler, and of course at the top of the tier there was Lincoln, there was Imperial, as well as there was Cadillac. And if you were anybody who's anybody in America, babes, you had a Cadillac or you had a Lincoln. Now the Imperial is kind of like cool, but a lot of people kind of forget about Lincoln. And we also can't forget about Dodge as well. Okay, so here's the thing. Toward the end of the 50s, everything's good, everything's status quo. The Americans are sitting good and all right, but the 60s would change everything.
There's no stopping a Toyota. It's the toughest, guttiest, keep-goingest power package ever built.
You see, towards the 60s is where we begin to see the first injection of Japanese material, which would be the Toyota Crown. But that is not the first import to hit the US soil, as that goes to the Volkswagen Beetle, which ironically is related to Germany. And of course, during that time, we obviously know that the Volkswagen Beetle was the people's car, so it was a world car. And of course, the Toyota Crown, well, it was cool, it was nice, but that was not exactly what really fueled the Japanese competition. So in case you all don't know, there's a problem that happens when you get a little too comfortable and a little too complacent. There's a reason why LeBron is constantly working to make sure he shuts you hoes up. There is a reason why Beyonce will never stop, because she knows y'all are hot on her trail. There's a reason why Drake will never stop. Well, there was Kendrick, but that's besides the point. The 60s was a crazy time for American car makers. And of course, with any good times comes bad times. And thus the 70s hit. Now, the 70s is very important because the 70s, unlike any other decade, changed the way that Americans bought cars. You see, prior to, a lot of the American cars were big bodied, rear wheel drive typically, and most importantly, wide. They were ergonomically not exactly friendly. And the biggest complaint for a lot of consumers is that they simply did not last. And there was a lot of sheet metal and poorly constructed plastics to make those cars work, but more importantly, the mechanicals underneath the sheet metal was just not of particular standard. And so towards the 70s, we get to the Clean Air Act of 1970, and more importantly, we get into the big shebang, which is the gas crisis of 1973. Now, these two things are very important in that the Clean Air Act, which was signed by President Nixon at the time, who basically was enforcing some EPA stuff and pretty much required that there were certain regulations enforced to be able to help these cars improve gas mileage, because apparently the gas mileage back then on average was roughly around 13.4 miles per gallon. But in addition to that, it was also an effort to help clean up the air command, because we had a huge amount of smog at the time, and a lot of that was cleaned up by the catalytic converter. But the catalytic converter is a very expensive piece of equipment, and a lot of the American car makers was not having it. They was like, girl, f you. And so that was kind of the fatal flaw. Over in Japan, they were already working on that. They were already focusing their efforts on making sure that not only they adjust their engineering, but more importantly, packaging it in a way that was small but efficient and did everything you need to do and was simply reliable. Now, fast forward into the gas crisis of 1973, and it gets crazy. Essentially what happened was the cost of oil went up tenfold, and Americans were not ready. And in all of that, being that most American consumers had big tanks on wheels, it was a problem. You could find gas nowhere. And of course, because you couldn't find gas anywhere, it became more of a crisis for a lot of Americans, because essentially we needed to have more efficiency in our vehicles. Now, here was the problem. The real problem in all of this is that many of the people who were driving these American cars were also loyalists to the American car brands, as many of them had these cars passed down from generation to generation, some of them being a part of the workforce of these car makers. As of course you know, the American car industry is a huge part of the American infrastructure and its history. And of course, a lot of people had reluctancy, because this is 30 years past the war. A lot of people did not want Japanese made cars. And unfortunately, It was the gas or your pride. And I don't think your boss is gonna care how you get to work as long as you get to work. And so thus the first few cars that rolled out being the Datsun 1000, there was the Toyota Crown, of course the Corolla, and there was also the Honda Civic CVCC. Now the CVCC is a big game changer. For the first time, a small, fuel-efficient car that did not have a catalytic converter passed the emissions regulations and pretty much changed the way that we see cars. Now, of course, Toyota is a bigger nameplate for a lot of people simply because it is just of the highest quality and reliability, but we really wouldn't understand that as a nation till several years later, as many of the American car makers were truly struggling. Now, here's the thing. In this time period, America got caught with its pants down. You see, there were cars out there that were big body, especially we had just released the Mustang not too long ago, the Corvette, and these are all coupes, but things like the Malibu and the Belvedere and the Crown Victoria and all of these different cars that were out there, no, not when gas is costing you the equivalent of $17 a gallon. I'm estimating, but that's not really true. But I say all of that to say is that American car companies were stuck. It got to the point where they pretty much had to go back and look at the drawing board, and this is what creates what's called the malaise era. Now, towards the 70s and 80s, this is where you see some really crazy shit. One of them being the Ford Pinto, which we infamously know blows up when you run into the back of it. In addition to that, we also have the Ford Mustang 2, which is kind of one of my favorites. Not really because it's my favorite of the malaise era. All this would be led by Lee Iacocca, who would eventually go into the K cars, which would further perpetuate the malaise era, because a lot of those cars are pretty much seen as not exactly exciting. They're very drab, they're lackluster, they were overbloated and underpowered, and it was evident in everything that they did. The term malaise era is coined by Merle Martin, who pretty much described her family's Ford Granada and essentially said that the designs, the power, all of it was bad. It was just terrible. Fast forward into the latter part of the 70s and it was looking pretty bad. Now, tying all of this together, this is how we began to see the evolution and the dominance of the Japanese market, particularly between Nissan, which would be Datsun after they would be changing their name to Nissan, and then there was Honda, and then there was Toyota. All three of these really was kicking ass, and the big three could not hang. It got so bad that even Lee Iacocca would abruptly leave and change over to Chrysler, which we still don't know why, but the big three really struggled, and the struggle was evident in their products. And as we begin to see more of their sedans being produced, they look like yuck. Certain cars like the Cutlass Sierra, the Chevrolet Celebrity, as well as the Crown Victoria, there were a lot of cars that just were kind of bland, considering they're American, and the American styling from the 50s and 60s really didn't translate as well with the interior and the quality of the 80s, because many of them had shifted from rear-wheel drive cars to front-wheel drive cars, and it was evident they were trying really hard. In fact, the Americans were so shook that they ended up having to work with smaller Japanese companies. For example, General Motors with Isuzu, Chrysler with Mitsubishi, as well as Ford acquiring Mazda, because they simply could not enter that space because they didn't know what that was doing. And this historically has always been the problem, because I guess for Americans, we just really don't know how to make small things, and it's never been our forte. And get your mind out the gutter. And of course, there were some problems manufacturing, but the biggest thing to note is that during this time, we begin to see a lot of cost cutting. Now, the cost cutting isn't by short of any measure, because a lot of the American car makers were truly struggling financially, and you would begin to see the dominance of your big heavyweights, such as the Toyota Camry and the Honda Accord, Civic, Prelude, Nissan Stanza Altima, the Maxima, which those were more so towards the late 80s and 90s, but that's not changing what I'm saying. They were kicking ass. And even though that Nissan would later struggle with the development of the Renault Alliance, Nissan still remained a household name in durable, reliable cars, less the exception of the CVT, which I've talked about before if you want to check that out. But the whole point is that the American car companies simply could not last because they could not match the quality control of the Japanese manufacturers. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why is it that Japanese cars are so much better? One of the biggest things that I've noticed with Japanese cars, especially for cars such as Toyota and Honda, is that not only are they efficient and reliable, but typically underpowered in the sense of they dial the power back so that it preserves the engine. Unlike the American car makers, which we are notorious for a big performance, especially with brands like Pontiac and with Dodge and of course, Ford in some capacity, the Japanese manufacturers have always dialed their engines back. They may have always been punchy when you tune them, but for the most part, it is very evident that they intentionally conserve and reserve the energy output of those engines so that it could be much more efficient for the user and pretty much survive off little to nothing to pretty much make it a very well packaged and moderately powerful car. Now, the other thing is that they tend to focus on quality build control, and quiet as it's kept, many of the cars that are Japanese today are actually American, as both Toyota and Honda, Nissan have all had plants in the American market. And it's kind of crazy because the Japanese have had headquarters here in America, as well as manufacturing plants in America, producing cars that we know and love as Japanese. And they are just as American, if not more American, than the current counterparts of the Americans that are either exported from places like China, Australia, Germany, and many other places that we don't produce here. All of that being said, can the American sedan make a comeback? Here's the thing. I do believe that they can make a comeback. Y'all gotta actually buy them though. But in order to make a comeback, there would have to be a decline in the popularity of SUVs, meaning y'all would have to stop buying them, and more people would have to demand and command in your surveys that you want sedans, and you have to buy the sedans at a noticeable rate for manufacturers to decide that that's something that they want to pay attention to. Unfortunately, that would take many years of return, but this is a perfect opportunity considering we are going to EVs. The difference between a sedan and a SUV is that a sedan sits lower to the ground, it has better driving dynamics, and honestly, it looks less clunkier than a crossover, and it gives you a different edge as opposed to a SUV or crossover, which gives a bit of mommy energy, if you will. But overall, if consumers demand more sedans and actually buy them, then yes, they can in fact make a comeback in this industrial market. But with that being said, you guys leave me a comment below and let me know if you think American sedans can possibly return, because I believe they can and I believe they will, but only time will tell. Until the next episode, I will see you guys later.